The marriage was on paper only, until a blizzard trapped them for a whole week. I want to tell you about a week in February of 1887. I don't talk about it much, not because it was bad. The opposite, I suppose, and that kind of thing is harder to put words to than the bad kind. You know how it is. You'll tell a man about a horse that broke your leg without blinking, but the other thing, the thing that actually changed you, you carry that one quiet. So, February of 87, you were just a boy then, you wouldn't remember the winter, but I do. The stove. I keep coming back to the stove when I try to tell this right. Cast iron, three-legged, one leg shorter than the other two, so it sat with a tilt you got used to after a while. Left a burn ring on the floor planks from some previous tenant who didn't watch it close enough. It was the center of everything that week, the only warm thing for a quarter-mile in any direction, and the two of us kept orbiting it the way planets do something they can't name. Let me back up. The first day. The papers got signed in November. I want to be clear about what the arrangement was, because it matters for you to understand how the week played out. Clara Holt came out from Ohio on a mutual understanding that had been brokered by her brother-in-law, Emmett Dre, who ran the dry goods in Harlan, and who owed me a favor I'd been holding since '84. She was 34, a widow. Her husband had been a furniture man in Columbus who died of a chest thing, left her the house, which she had to sell to cover what he owed. She had a sister in Laramie she could have gone to, but the sister's husband was the kind of man you don't put a woman near. She needed a roof and standing. I needed someone to manage the domestic side of the ranch so I could stop losing hired hands to kitchens they didn't want to be cooking in. We met at Emmett's store on a Thursday. We talked for about 40 minutes. She was direct, which I respected, and she didn't try to be something she wasn't, which I respected more. She said she could cook, sew, keep accounts, and manage a pantry. She said she was not looking for a companion in any sentimental sense. Those were her exact words. I still hear them. But she needed the arrangement to be legal and permanent because she wasn't going to spend the rest of her life holding her breath about what came next. I said that was fine by me. We signed in front of Emmett and the circuit preacher on a Saturday morning in November. She moved her 2 trunks into the spare room. I moved my account books off the kitchen table, and that was about the extent of it. We were polite. We ate meals. She cooked well, better than well, and I told her so, and she said thank you in the tone of someone who has been told they do a thing adequately and has decided to accept it as sufficient. We didn't talk much beyond what the day required. Stock prices, what needed ordering, whether the north fence was holding, that kind of thing. I thought it was working fine. I thought it was exactly what it was supposed to be. Then February came, and the sky went white and the world disappeared. I heard it starting around 3 in the morning, that particular quality of wind that isn't just wind, that has mass to it, that pushes against the cabin walls like it has a grievance. I got up and looked out and couldn't see the fence post that sat 8 feet from the window, just white, moving white. By first light, I had already lost the morning. I got as far as the barn. I know that stretch of ground like I know my own hands, walked it 10,000 times, and I still had to feel my way along the rope I keep strung between the 2 buildings for exactly this reason. The horses were all right, nervous but all right. I fed them extra and stayed until they settled. When I pushed back out into the white, it hit me in the face like a thrown blanket. Clara was at the stove when I came back in. She'd heard me get up. She'd put coffee on, and she was standing there in a heavy wool robe with her hair not yet done, which I hadn't seen before. And she looked at me coming in off the cold with snow packed into every crease of my coat, and she said, without particular alarm, "How bad?" I said, "Bad enough." She handed me the coffee cup, and I stood there dripping on her clean floor, and she didn't say a word about that. I want to remember that right. I've tried to remember it right 100 times. She handed me that cup and the warmth of it went through my hands and up into my arms, and I think that's the first moment I actually looked at her. Not just saw her the way you see furniture in a room you walk through every day, but looked. The set of her shoulders. The way she was watching the window with a kind of stillness that wasn't fear, more like someone who has been through hard things and knows that the first hour of them is mostly just weather. I said, "We won't be going anywhere for a while." She said, "I know." That was the first day. The second day. I think about the second day differently from the rest of them. The second day was still the arrangement. We were just two people stuck in a house together who happened to have papers between them. We were careful with each other in the way you're careful with someone you don't fully know yet, giving each other room, moving around each other in the small space of the kitchen, and the main room with a kind of elaborate courtesy that I later understood was both of us trying very hard not to be a burden. I spent most of the morning figuring out what we had in the way of stores. Clara had kept good inventory, better than I'd have done it, and we were all right on the essentials. Flour, salt pork, dried beans, coffee, half a barrel of potatoes going soft at the edges, a jar of blackstrap molasses that had crystallized at the top, 24 eggs she'd gotten from the Haggerty farm the week before. Not rich eating, but enough. The wind didn't let up. I tried to work on the ledger books and couldn't keep my mind on them. I kept hearing the storm and running the numbers in my head about the cattle, where they might have drifted, which of them I'd lose before this was done. That's the kind of arithmetic that has no solution until the weather breaks, but your mind does it anyway, and it isn't pleasant company. Clara sat at the table in the afternoon and mendied. I watched her hands without meaning to, not in any kind of way, just the way you watch someone work who works well. She had a particular efficiency about her. No wasted motion. A needle going in and out, and she'd bite the thread and you could hear the slight sound of it, and the whole time her face was as composed as someone doing a sum they've done before. I said around 4 o'clock, "Where'd you learn to sew like that?" She looked up. I don't think she'd expected me to talk. She said her mother had taught her, and her mother was the daughter of a woman who'd been a seamstress in Pennsylvania Dutch country, and that certain things moved in families whether the next generation wanted them or not. I said I supposed that was true about ranching too. She said her father had been a clockmaker. She'd learned clocks too, she said, but they were less useful out here. I said I had a pocket watch that had been running slow for 2 years if she wanted something to occupy her hands. She looked at me a moment, then she said, "Bring it here." I fished it out of my vest pocket. Silver case, a little worn at the edges, my father's as it happens. I set it on the table, and she picked it up and turned it over in her hands, and pried the back case with a hairpin from her pocket and bent over it. She had it running right inside of 20 minutes. I don't know why that mattered as much as it did. It was a small thing. But I'd been living with a slow watch for 2 years and telling myself it didn't matter, and here she was fixing it like it was nothing, and I sat across from her and watched her close it back up and set it on the table between us, and I felt something I couldn't name precisely, but that had something to do with being taken care of in a way I hadn't asked for and hadn't expected. I said, "Thank you." She said, "It's a nice watch. You should have had it looked at sooner." Which, I suppose, is one way to accept gratitude. The third day the wind dropped and the snow came down instead of sideways, which sounds better but isn't necessarily. That kind of snowfall, straight down, heavy, dense, the kind that doesn't blow, piles fast. By noon we had 4 feet against the north wall. I could hear it settling on the roof, and I kept the fire hot enough that it wouldn't load up into something that would cause problems. Clara asked if there was anything she could do about the horses, and I said no, I'd go. She said she'd come with me. I told her she didn't need to. She said she understood she didn't need to, but 2 pairs of hands were faster than one, and she'd rather be useful than sit and watch the snow come down. I gave her my spare coat, which swallowed her, and she tucked the sleeves back and we went out together. I want to tell you about that walk, because it was one of those things you don't forget. The world was completely silent except for the muffled crunch of our boots. The snow was well past knee-height, and we had to lift and plant with every step, and she did it without complaint, following in my tracks to make it easier, and I kept looking back to check her, and each time she just met my eyes and nodded. At one point she went down, sank sideways into a drift where the ground fell away a bit, and I reached back and got her by the arm and pulled, and she came up out of it with a face full of snow, and she stood there a second, and then she laughed. I hadn't heard her laugh before. It surprised me enough that I stood there holding her arm and looking at her, and the laugh ran out, and her eyes were bright from the cold and the exertion, and she shook the snow off her face and said, "Well, that's what I get." We did the horses. It took most of an hour. On the way back she fell twice more, and I got her both times, and by the time we pushed back in through the cabin door we were both red-faced and wet, and she was breathing hard. She stood by the stove and steamed, and I poured whiskey into 2 tin cups and handed her one, and she took it without any ceremony and drank. I said, "You didn't have to do that." She said, "You said that already." I said I knew. She said, I didn't come out here to be a parlor decoration, Mr. Calloway. That was the first time in all those months she'd said anything that told me what she thought of the arrangement from the inside. It landed on me in a particular way. Not because it was angry, it wasn't, exactly, but because it was honest. She'd been doing the careful, polite dance the same as me, and for just a second she'd stepped out of it. I said, James. She looked at me. I said, my name is James. I think you can call me that. She turned back to the stove and wrapped both hands around the tin cup. After a moment she said, Clara then. We ate beans and salt pork that night, and it was the best meal I remember from that cabin. And I don't know why except that we ate it like two people who had just done something together instead of two people who happened to be in the same room. The fourth day. I have to tell you about the fourth day carefully because there's a version of it that sounds like something it wasn't, and I want you to understand what it actually was. The fourth day she was sick. I don't know if it was the cold from the day before or something that had been building. She said she'd had a scratchy throat 2 nights prior, but hadn't mentioned it. But she woke up gray in the face and stayed at the table for breakfast with her hands around her cup and didn't eat. I asked her what she needed. She said she was fine. I looked at her for a moment, and she looked back, and we both understood that she was not fine. I said, what do you need? Not a question that time. She was quiet. I think she wasn't used to being asked directly or wasn't used to answering. She looked at the cup in her hands. Then she said, if you have any willow bark, and I'd sleep better if I was warm. I had willow bark. I made the tea. It's a bitter, thin thing, willow bark tea, but it does what it does. She drank it in the chair nearest the stove, and I built the fire up hot enough that the iron sides glowed at the base. Then I went and got the quilt off my bed, the good one, heavy wool batting, that my mother had made, and I brought it out and put it around her shoulders without asking, and she didn't say anything about that. She just pulled it tighter and leaned toward the stove. I spent the day close. I did what work I could inside, harness repairs, re-edging a knife that had gone dull, going over the feed accounts, and every hour or so I'd get up and make her drink something, water or more tea, or I'd check the fire. She slept in the chair in the afternoon, and I sat across from her, and I looked at her face in the firelight for longer than I should probably tell you about. She looked young when she slept. She had a kind of guardedness about her face when she was awake, not unkind, just careful, and it went away when she slept. She looked like someone who'd been tired for a long time and had finally been allowed to put it down. Around dusk, she woke up and I was sitting there reading, and she looked at me for a moment before she fully came to. She said, how long have you been there? I said, a while. She pulled the quilt tighter. The firelight moved on the wall. She said, you didn't have to sit with me. I said, I know. She looked at me a moment and I looked back at her, and that was the whole conversation. But something moved in it that I didn't have a name for yet, and wasn't in any hurry to try. The fifth day. She was better on the fifth day. Not well, but better, up and moving, color back in her face, a little stiff about the chest when she breathed hard. She tried to take over the cooking, and I told her I'd been cooking for myself for 15 years, and she could sit down, which started a brief argument that she won because she pointed out that the biscuits I'd made on the fourth day were an embarrassment to the flour that went into them, which was fair. The fifth day is when we started talking. I mean really talking. Not the weather or the cattle or what needed ordering, the other kind, where you don't know how you got to the subject, but you're in it before you've decided whether you wanted to be. I don't remember exactly what started it. I think she asked about my father's watch, how I'd come to have it, and I told her about my father, and that led somewhere, and somewhere led somewhere else. I told her about coming out to the Wyoming Territory in '72, just 23 years old and considerably more confident than I had any reason to be, with my brother Walt and $500 between us that we'd borrowed from an uncle in St. Louis who didn't expect to see it again. About the first winter, which nearly finished both of us. About Walt going back east in '75 to marry a woman in Kansas City, leaving me the claim and the debt, and the beginning of something I spent the next 12 years building into a working cattle operation that I will admit in the right light is something to be proud of. I told her about my wife. I hadn't talked about Margaret to anyone in I don't know how long. Not because I was still broken about it. It had been 9 years, and you don't stay broken for 9 years. Or you do, but differently it changes texture. but because there didn't seem much point. She died of a fever in the summer of '78, our first year on the new piece of ground, and we'd been married 14 months. And some things you carry and some things you put down, and this one I'd put down because I had no choice. And picking it up again to show people felt like work I didn't have the occasion for. But that day I told Clara about Margaret, the color of her hair, which was black as wet coal, the way she'd named every horse on the property within a week of arriving, the fact that she sang to herself when she was working and probably didn't know she did it. Clara listened the way very few people listen, not waiting for her turn, just there with it. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You did right by her." I said I didn't know about that. She said, "You remembered her right. That's doing right by someone." I looked at her. She was watching the stove. I said, "Were you happy with your husband?" She was quiet long enough that I thought I'd asked something I shouldn't have. Then she said, "He was a decent man. He tried. We were not well suited." She paused. I mourned him properly, but mostly I mourned what I'd hoped for, which I understand is a selfish kind of grief. I said I didn't think it was selfish. She looked at me then, direct, measuring, and I had the sense that she was deciding something, or had already decided it, and was just checking her own mind about it. She said, "What did you hope for when you made the arrangement?" I thought about that. I wanted to give her an honest answer because she'd given me one. I said to stop rattling around in a house built for more people than were in it, to have the practical things handled by someone who knew what they were doing. I wasn't hoping for much more than that. She nodded slowly. She said, "That's what I thought." Not unkind, just clear-eyed. I said, "What did you hope for?" She looked back at the stove. Same, more or less, stability, a roof, something predictable for once. She turned the tin cup in her hands. "I didn't expect to like it." I said, "Like what?" She said this, a small motion of her hand. "The place, the work." She stopped, started again. "I didn't expect to feel useful." I said, "You are useful." She made a small sound that wasn't quite a laugh. I said, "I mean it." She said, "I know, that's what surprised me." Outside, the snow kept coming down. Inside, the stove ticked and popped. I don't know what time it was. It had gotten to where I stopped caring what time it was, which should have told me something. The sixth day. The sixth day, the storm began to think about ending. You can feel that in the air, something releasing, the weight of it lightening, even when the snow is still heavy and the wind still running. I've been in enough bad winters to read it. I told Clara I thought it would break by the next morning. She said, "Good." And I felt that the way you feel a cold draft from a door that's opened in another room. I went out and did the horses, and when I came back, she was at the table with pen and paper writing a letter. I hung up my coat and went to the stove to warm my hands, and I could see from across the room that it was to her sister in Laramie. I didn't read it. I wasn't close enough, but I saw the salutation and I knew. I said, "Everything all right?" She said, "Fine, I just haven't written in a few weeks." I said, "Of course." I went back to the harness work I'd started the day before. The afternoon went quiet, not a bad quiet, but a different one from the days before, like something had shifted back. We were being careful with each other again in a way that felt like putting on a coat you'd taken off, and the coat fit wrong now, but you put it on because that's what the coat is for. She cooked supper and it was good, as it always was, and we ate, and she told me about her sister's children, whom she clearly loved. She came alive a little talking about them, the edge of a real smile, and I listened and asked a few questions, and we were polite as the first week of November again. After supper, she went to her room, and I sat by the stove. I'm not going to tell you I knew exactly what I was thinking. I'm going to tell you what I did, which was pour 2 fingers of whiskey into a cup and sit there with it and not drink it for a long time. Just sit. Watched the fire through the grate. The wind had dropped to something almost ordinary. I didn't sleep well that night. The 7th day. I was up before first light. Old habit or something else, I'm not sure which. The storm was done. I knew before I looked. The quality of the silence outside was the clean kind, not the muffled kind. I went to the window and the sky had that particular blue-gray of pre-dawn after a big snow, and the drifts were enormous and still, the whole world white and smooth and completely silent. I put coffee on. I heard her door when the coffee was near done. Footsteps, then the sound of the wash basin. Then she came out in that same heavy robe and her hair down, which I'd got used to by now, first thing in the morning. She looked at the window. She said, "It's done." I said, "Yes." She stood at the window for a moment. I poured 2 cups and set one on the table for her. She came and sat and wrapped both hands around it. We didn't say anything for a while. Finally she said, "The roads will be bad." I said, "For a few days, probably." She said, "I'll need to get a message to Emmett. Let him know we're all right." I said, "I'll ride in when the drifts settle enough. Day after tomorrow, maybe." She nodded. I looked at my coffee. I said, "Clara." She looked up. I said, "I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer it straight, the way you've answered everything this week." She waited. Her hands were still on the cup. Her face was its composed self, that careful stillness, but her eyes were doing something else. I said, "The arrangement. You came out here for what you needed, and I came into it for what I needed, and we both said that was enough." I paused. "Is it still enough for you?" A long moment. She said, "Are you asking if I want to go?" I said, "I'm asking what you want. I don't think I asked you that before." She looked at me, not the measuring look this time, something steadier. She said, "I want to stay." I said, "For the practical reasons." She said no, her voice was quiet, "Not anymore." I sat with that. She said, "Is that going to be a problem?" I said no. She nodded once, the way she nodded when something was settled. Then she looked back at her cup. I reached across the table. I put my hand over hers, just that, just my hand over hers on the cup, and I felt her go still for a second, and then her fingers turned and she held on. The stove popped. Outside, the sky was getting lighter. The drifts would be 5 feet at least against the barn. The road into Harlan would be buried for days. The cattle were somewhere, and I'd spend the next week sorting that out and losing some that I'd find dead in the draws come spring. There was a great deal of hard work on the far side of this morning. But at that table in the lamplight, with her hand in mine and the coffee going cold between us, none of that had started yet. She looked up at me, not with anything dramatic, just looked. And what I saw in her face was the same thing I imagined she saw in mine, which was that the arrangement had quietly become something neither of us had contracted for, and both of us had needed for a very long time. I held her hand, and the fire burned low, and the new daylight came in off the snow, and turned everything in that room pale and clean. I don't have a neater ending than that to give you. That was the week. That was February of '87. The stove's still there in that cabin. I've replaced just about everything in the house over the years, walls, floors, the roof once. But I left the stove. I told Clara it was because it worked fine, and there was no sense spending money on a thing that worked fine. She said she knew exactly why I left it. She was right, of course. She generally is.